Before we begin, close the noise of the world for a moment. Put down whatever it is you are carrying, because what you are about to hear is not simply a story from an old book, it is a mirror. And depending on who you are and how you have been living, looking into it might be the most uncomfortable thing you have done in a very long time. From the very earliest pages of human history, from the moment the first man placed his foot on this earth and drew his first breath, the world has been visited by a recurring disease. Not plague, not famine, not war in the simple sense, something older and more stubborn than all of those. The disease of arrogance. The infection of the soul that convinces a man, convinces him with terrifying certainty that he is more than he is, that the ground beneath his feet belongs to him because he stands on it, that the air in his lungs is his by right, that the beating of his own heart is evidence of his permanence, rather than a mercy granted moment by the one who needs nothing and sustains everything. Power does this to people, not to all people, but to enough of them that history has had to record the lesson over and over, in civilization after civilization, in language after language, in ruin after ruin, because each generation seems to need to learn it fresh for itself. The moment a mortal tastes authority, something can shift inside him, something subtle, something that does not announce itself. He does not wake up one morning and declare, "Today I will become a tyrant." It happens slowly. First, the power is useful, a tool for order, for protection, for the good of the people. Then it becomes comfortable, then necessary, then identity, then sacred. And somewhere in that long drift from useful to sacred, the man forgets the clay from which he was formed. He forgets that he is borrowed breath in a borrowed body, walking borrowed ground. And in that forgetting, the disaster begins. The scholars of Islam, drawing from the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, have told us that among all the rulers who ever walked this earth, 4 held dominion over the world or the greater part of it. 4 kings whose reach and power exceeded the ordinary measure of human authority. 2 of those 4 were believers, men whose kingship was built on submission to the Creator, and whose authority was a trust rather than a trophy. Solomon, the prophet king, who commanded not only men but wind and jinn and the language of birds. And Dhul-Qarnayn, the just traveler of the earth, who journeyed from the rising of the sun to its setting, and whose reach extended to the very edges of the known world. These 2 knew where power came from and to whom it ultimately belonged. Their crowns sat lightly on their heads because they understood that the true king was elsewhere. The other 2 were a different matter entirely. They ruled, they dominated, they placed their boots on the necks of nations, but they did not believe. And in not believing, they made the most catastrophic error available to a human being. They looked at everything they commanded, the armies, the palaces, the treasuries, the shaking earth beneath the feet of their soldiers, and they concluded that it was theirs, not borrowed, not granted, theirs, by right of strength, by right of birth, by right of conquest. And from that conclusion, there was nowhere left to go except up. And up, in their case, meant toward a claim that should have been unutterable, that they themselves were God. One of those 2 is the subject of everything that follows. His name, in the Islamic tradition, is Namrud, and his story is not merely ancient history preserved in the amber of old texts. It is a living warning dressed in the clothing of the past, speaking directly to the present, to this world, to this moment, to every soul that has ever tasted a little power and felt the first whisper of that terrible temptation, the whisper that says, "You are special, you are different. The rules that apply to others do not apply to you." Namrud ruled in Babylon, ancient Babylon, a civilization so magnificent in its time that even its ruins, scattered across the broken ground of what is now Iraq, still make the visitor stop and stand in something close to awe. The Babylonians built in ways that the ancient world marveled at. They organized society, codified law, mapped the stars, and raised structures of cut stone and fired brick that were meant to outlast every human generation that followed. Babylon was not a primitive place. It was, in its time, the center of the known world, the heart of civilization, the city that all roads, in some sense, led to. And over this city, over this empire, over this people with their extraordinary learning and their star worship and their idols of carved stone and their rituals performed under the light of 1,000 lamps, over all of this, Namrud was absolute. The scholars who have passed this account through the generations tell us that he was the first ruler to place a royal crown upon his own head, not received from a predecessor, not earned through recognized right. Placed there by his own hand, as if to announce to the world, this is where authority begins and ends, with me. The crown was not a symbol of duty, it was a declaration of ownership. He clad that kingship in extravagance that had not been seen before, in fabrics and metals and ceremony that were designed not to honor the people or the divine, but to announce his own incomparable greatness to anyone who looked. And people looked. For centuries, they looked. The scholars say he ruled for nearly 400 years. 400 years of absolute dominion. 400 years in which the name Namrud meant not a person but a condition of the earth, the way gravity is a condition of the earth, simply present, simply inescapable, simply the way things are. Generations were born under him and died under him and knew nothing else. He enslaved, he punished, he expanded. He crushed resistance with the systematic efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped thinking of his subjects as people and had begun to think of them as his property, as cattle are property, managed and slaughtered according to the owner's convenience. And through all of this, through all 400 years of dominion and excess and cruelty, the intoxication deepened. It does not take 400 years for a man to become arrogant, but it takes a very long time for arrogance to reach its final destination. The destination where a man looks at the universe and decides that the position currently occupied by the creator of the universe is one that he himself could fill. This is where Namrud arrived. Not quickly. Not in a moment of madness. He arrived there through the slow accumulation of 4 centuries of unchallenged power, aided, the scholars tell us, by the whisperings of Satan, who has always understood that the surest way to destroy a man is not to attack him from outside, but to feed his pride from within until pride itself becomes the destruction. Namrud did not merely declare himself king, he declared himself lord and sustainer of the world. He declared himself the God of his people. And the terrible, devastating truth is that his people, drenched as they were in the idolatry of star worship and the confusion of polytheism, accustomed as they were to bowing before things made by human hands, his people were not entirely resistant to this claim. A people who had already lowered themselves before carved stone were not far from lowering themselves before living flesh. A people who had already confused the creation for the Creator were primed to accept a man who offered himself as the highest point in their religious universe. To enforce this claim, Namrud employed a weapon older and more reliable than any army: hunger. The land of Babylon was in the grip of famine. When the granaries hold the difference between life and death, the man who controls the granaries controls everything. And so the palace gates were opened each day to the desperate and the hollow-eyed, the families with nothing left, the farmers whose fields had turned to dust, the merchants whose caravans had returned empty. They came in their crowds, their bowls and their prayers and their diminished dignity in their hands, and before a single grain was given, before a single mouthful of mercy was extended, each man and woman and child had to answer a question. Not a complicated question, not a philosophical puzzle, a simple, brutal, inescapable question. Who is your Lord? Those who said Namrud Those who were willing to pay the price of their soul for a sack of grain, they walked away fed. Those who said otherwise, those whose faith was stronger than their hunger, or whose pride was stronger than their need, they met torture, they met imprisonment. They met a cruelty calibrated not to kill quickly, but to make an example slowly. By this method, by the lever of starvation and the hammer of fear, Namrud manufactured a kind of worship. People said his name where they should have said Allah's. They bowed where they should have stood upright. They exchanged their dignity for bread. And Namrud, watching it all from his high throne, counting the souls as a moneylender, counts coins, believed that this constituted divinity, that this constituted proof, that if enough people called him Lord, then Lord he must be. But the world is not governed by what men declare. It is governed by what is true. And the truth was about to arrive in Babylon in a form that Namrud had not prepared for and could not have anticipated. Not an army, not a rival king, a young man from among his own people, a seeker, a thinker, a soul that had looked at the same stars the Babylonians worshipped and had seen not gods, but signs, signs pointing toward the one who made them and who would outlast them all when the last star finally burned out and fell. His name was Ibrahim. And the confrontation between Ibrahim and Namrud is one of the most extraordinary exchanges in all of human history, a moment when the entire architecture of false power was put on trial and found to be as hollow as the idols that stood in Babylon's temples. Ibrahim had been asking questions since he was a child, looking at the moon rising and saying, "Perhaps this is my Lord," then watching it set and understanding, "No. Something that sets cannot be the sustainer of all things," looking at the sun blazing at midday and considering the possibility, then watching it dip beneath the horizon and knowing, no. The one who never sleeps and never sets and never diminishes is not to be found in the sky's decorations. He is the maker of the decorations. He is the one before whom the stars and the moon and the sun all bow, all diminish, all rise and set, according to a schedule they did not choose and cannot alter. This clarity, hard won, honestly arrived at made Ibrahim dangerous, not dangerous with weapons, dangerous with truth. And truth, in the hands of a person who is genuinely not afraid, is the most destabilizing force in the universe of a tyrant. Because a tyrant's entire power rests on the ability to control what people believe, and a man who has found something true outside the tyrant's control is a man the tyrant cannot fully own. The news of Ibrahim reached Namrud's throne, the way news of danger always reaches thrones quickly and with alarm. Who is this young man in my kingdom who refuses the question at the granary gate? Who is this soul that looks at my power and sees not God, but man? Bring him here. And Ibrahim came, not trembling, not negotiating, not looking for a compromise between truth and safety. He came the way a man comes when he knows that the one behind him is greater than the one in front of him. There is a moment in every court of power when the room holds its breath. When the man on the throne looks at the man standing before him and makes a calculation, how much of a threat is this, and how quickly can it be dissolved? The calculation is usually reliable. Throne rooms are designed to produce a specific psychological effect. The height of the seat, the breadth of the hall, the rows of armed soldiers, the ministers arranged like an audience at a performance, all of it is architecture in the service of a single message. You are small, and he is great, and the gap between you is unbridgeable. Most people who are brought before power in this way feel that gap. They feel it in their knees and in their voice and in the sudden unreliability of their own thoughts. Ibrahim felt none of it. This is not because he was reckless or because he did not understand what he was standing in front of. Ibrahim was not naive. He understood exactly the nature of Namrud's power, the armies, the executions, the granary gates, the 4 centuries of unchallenged dominion. He understood all of it clearly. The reason it did not intimidate him was not that he underestimated the danger. It was that he had something in his chest that was more solid than any throne room was designed to shake. The certainty of a man who has genuinely found the truth and genuinely tested it and genuinely arrived at submission to the one who made the throne and the throne room and the king sitting in it. That certainty is a different substance from ordinary human courage. It does not depend on the odds. It does not depend on the audience. It does not depend on anything that the world can give or take. So when the question came and the court leaned forward to hear the answer, because this was entertainment as much as justice, the spectacle of the small man being reminded of his smallness when the question came, Ibrahim answered it without decoration and without fear. "Who do you accept as Lord?" "My Lord," he said, "is he who gives life and causes death. Not you, not the stars, not the idols your people have carved and placed on pedestals and bowed before. The one who holds the switch of existence itself, the one who says to a thing, be, and it becomes, the one before whom every breath in this room is borrowed, including yours." Now watch what Namrud did with this answer, because it tells you everything about the nature of arrogance at its most advanced stage, the stage where it is no longer capable of honest engagement, the stage where it has become a prison that the prisoner mistakes for a palace. Namrud did not think. He performed. He had no interest in the question of whether Ibrahim was right. The question of whether Ibrahim was right was, to Namrud's mind, entirely beside the point. The point was the audience. The point was the court. The point was the demonstration of who was in control of this conversation and therefore in control of everything. So he devised a spectacle. Two prisoners were brought into the hall. One condemned to death, the sentence already passed, the execution already scheduled. The other innocent, holding nothing but his own bewildered fear in the charged air of the throne room. Namrud looked at Ibrahim, looked at the court, and then, with the theatrical confidence of a man who has mistaken cleverness for wisdom, he reversed the verdicts. The condemned man was released. The innocent man was executed. "There," he said, turning to Ibrahim with satisfaction written across every feature of his face. "You said your Lord gives life and causes death. I give life, and I give death. What does your Lord have that I do not?" It was, in its way, a breathtaking move. Not because it was true or because it was wise, but because it was designed to close the conversation before it could go somewhere that Namrud could not follow. He had taken the terms of Ibrahim's argument, life and death, and he had staged a demonstration that made him, in the surface reading, appear to have the same authority. The court saw it and was satisfied. The ministers nodded. The generals remained expressionless in the way that powerful men's subordinates always remain expressionless, not because they feel nothing, but because they have learned that feeling nothing is the safest policy in a room where the man at the top decides everything. But Ibrahim was not impressed, and more than that, he was not fooled, because what Namrud had done was not give life and give death. He had given release and given execution. He had moved a human being from one category of fate to another, using the power of command over other human beings. But no human command, however absolute, reaches to the actual mechanism of existence. No king has ever issued a decree that made dead cells breathe again. No throne has ever been high enough to reach the switch that determines whether a heart beats or stops. What Namrud had demonstrated was human authority over human circumstances, which is real, but which is not what Ibrahim was talking about, not even slightly. Ibrahim saw this clearly. He saw also that arguing the point would be futile, not because the point was wrong, but because Namrud's mind was not in a state to receive it. A mind that is performing for an audience cannot simultaneously reason toward truth. So Ibrahim did something that the scholars have marveled at across 14 centuries of commentary. He did not argue on Namrud's terms. He changed the ground entirely. He lifted the debate to a place where no performance was possible, where no substitution could be staged, where no clever reversal of prisoners could create the illusion of divine power. "My Lord," Ibrahim said, "makes the sun rise from the east. This is not a matter of decree or army or policy. This is the order of creation itself, established before the first king drew breath and continuing unchanged through every dynasty that has risen and fallen since. If you are truly God, if the title you have given yourself corresponds to anything real in the structure of existence, then make the sun rise from the west, today, now, in front of this court. In front of everyone assembled here who has heard you claim what you have claimed. The Quran records what followed in a single sentence of devastating economy. The disbeliever was confounded. That is all it says. It does not say he argued back. It does not say he tried another performance. It does not say he ordered Ibrahim's execution to change the subject. He was confounded. The word in Arabic carries the sense of being struck dumb, of being left without any road forward, of having the entire architecture of one's position revealed in a single moment as a structure with no foundation. The sun continued on its path. The east received it, and the west released it, and the universe paid absolutely no attention to the man who had placed a crown on his own head and declared himself its master. This is one of the most important moments in the Quran's account of this story, and it deserves to be sat with longer than most people sit with it. Because what Ibrahim did in that throne room was not simply win a debate. He demonstrated something about the nature of real power versus claimed power, a distinction that is as relevant today as it was in ancient Babylon. As relevant in every boardroom and parliament and social media platform where human beings conduct the ongoing theater of their own importance, real power does not need to perform. Real power is not affected by whether anyone in the room agrees with it. The sun does not consult Namrud's court before it rises. The ocean does not ask permission before it breaks on the shore. The laws of the universe operate with a serenity and a consistency that the most powerful human authority cannot touch, and that serenity is itself a form of testimony, a daily, perpetual, inescapable testimony to the sovereignty of the one who set those laws in motion. Namrud was confounded. But confounded is not the same as changed. And this is perhaps the most sobering truth in the entire account, that a man can be proven wrong in the most complete and public and inescapable way and still not change. This is not unusual. History is full of it. The Pharaoh saw miracle after miracle and hardened his heart after each one. The people of Lut saw the corruption of their civilization and continued in it. The people of Nu were warned for 950 years, and the majority refused until the water came. Human beings are capable of extraordinary stubbornness in the defense of a position they have decided they want to be true, and the more power is built on that position, the more the ego has been invested in it. The more the entire identity has become dependent on it, the harder it becomes to surrender it, even in the face of undeniable evidence. Namrud went back to his throne, defeated in argument but harder in pride. He had lost the debate, but he was not going to lose the kingdom, not to a young man with no army, no palace, no political standing, no material power of any kind. And so, in the way of tyrants confronted with a truth they cannot accept, he escalated. If he could not win the argument, he would escalate beyond argument into a realm where argument was irrelevant, the realm of raw force. He attempted to burn Ibrahim alive. A fire was built of a magnitude that the narrations describe as so immense that birds could not fly near it without being scorched. And into that fire Ibrahim was thrown. And Allah, who had been with Ibrahim through every moment of his search for truth and his confrontation with power, spoke to the fire, the words that no fire in the history of creation had ever been told to follow: "Be cool and safe upon Ibrahim." And the fire obeyed. As every created thing obeys, not out of choice, not out of feeling, but because that is the nature of creation in relation to the Creator. The fire that Namrud built to erase Ibrahim became, by the decree of Allah, the proof of Ibrahim's protection and the proof of Namrud's impotence before the real power of the universe. Ibrahim walked out of that fire unscorched, while the soldiers who had thrown him in were burned by the heat. The lesson was written in flame and ash on the ground of Babylon for anyone with eyes to read it. But Namrud had already stopped reading lessons. He had long since crossed the threshold beyond which new information is processed, not as information, but as threat. Every demonstration of the truth that Ibrahim carried was experienced by Namrud not as an invitation to reconsider, but as an attack to be repelled. This is the final and most dangerous stage of arrogance, when it becomes genuinely incapable of learning. When the mechanism that exists in a human being for updating, understanding, and changing course has been so thoroughly corroded by pride that it no longer functions, Namrud was at that stage. And so, in the madness that characterizes pride at its most extreme, he decided not merely to resist Ibrahim's God, but to make war on him. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. Making war on God. Even typing those words requires a kind of effort to fully comprehend the state of mind they describe. This is not a man who has simply made a bad decision or held a mistaken belief. This is a man whose arrogance has carried him so far from the shared ground of human sanity that he is prepared to organize a military campaign against the creator of the universe. And this is the part that should make every reader sit in quiet contemplation. For a while, he was not alone. He had a court full of ministers and generals and officials and soldiers who, if they thought this was madness, said nothing. Because that is what power does to the people around power. It makes silence the only safe option, and in the silence of people who should have spoken, the madness continues, amplified and unopposed, until it reaches its conclusion. The conclusion, in Namrud's case, began with a tower and ended with a mosquito. And between those two endpoints is a story about the nature of divine justice, about the particular, precise, perfectly calibrated way in which Allah deals with a soul that has placed itself beyond the reach of mercy. Namrud ordered his engineers to build a structure so high it would pierce the ceiling of the sky. He would climb it. He would reach the heavens. He would find this God of Ibrahim and settle the matter by force. The tower rose, and then, by the will of Allah, it fell. There is a particular kind of silence that falls when the thing you built to prove yourself collapses. Not the silence of peace, or the silence of sleep, or the silence of a forest at dawn. A different silence. The silence of a man standing in front of the rubble of his own ambition, looking at the stones where the ceiling of his pride used to be, and feeling for perhaps the first time in his life the gap between what he imagined he was and what he actually is. The tower Namrud built to pierce the sky fell. The Quran tells us that with its fall, the languages of Babylon fractured. People who had shared a tongue found themselves unable to understand one another, as if the very act of that collective hubris, the building of a monument to human defiance of the divine, had shattered not just the structure, but the unity of the people who built it. The tower that was meant to announce Namrud's greatness to the heavens became instead the monument to his confusion, the landmark of his failure, the story that would follow his name across every generation that came after. But Namrud was not finished. A man who has spent 4 centuries building the architecture of his own godhood does not sit quietly among the rubble and reflect. He adapts, he improvises. He finds another vehicle for the same destination. If the tower would not carry him to the sky, he would find something that would, and so he turned to birds. Specifically to vultures, 4 of them, raised from hatching on raw meat, fed and trained until they were enormous and powerful and associated in every instinct with the upward lunge toward prey. A great wooden chest was constructed. Bait was suspended above it on long poles so that the vultures, seeing food above them and feeling the platform of the chest beneath their talons, would claw their way upward in the direction of what they wanted. Namrud climbed into this extraordinary contraption. The birds rose. The chest rose with them. The ground fell away. What must that have looked like from below? A king of Babylon, ascending in a wooden box, pulled by 4 giant birds, rising until the earth became haze, and the city beneath him was a pattern of walls and roads, and the glint of the Euphrates in the afternoon sun. The people watching from below, and surely they watched. Surely nothing in the history of Babylon had given the population more to stare at than this. What did they see? A god ascending to the heavens to do battle? A madman on the edge of the sky? Did any one of them, in the privacy of their own skull, think, "This will not end well"? Did any general or minister or soldier, standing in the courtyard below, feel the particular chill of watching someone you have served and feared do something that is clearly and catastrophically wrong, and knowing that the consequences are already traveling toward you all from the future? High above the earth, Namrud drew his bow. He fired arrows into the heavens. He fired them into what he believed was the address of the god he had decided to destroy. The scholars say that by the will of Allah, an arrow returned to him stained with blood, not from any wound he had inflicted on the divine, which is of course impossible. For nothing in the universe can wound the one who sustains the universe, but perhaps from some creature of the sky caught in the path of the projectile, returned as a kind of sign, or perhaps simply as part of the particular mercy of Allah in the story of Namrud, a mercy that would become apparent only later, a mercy of extension, of time given, of chances offered even to a man who did not deserve them. Namrud looked at the blood on the arrow. He descended. He returned to his court. And he announced, and this is the announcement that should make every person who hears it pause and feel a kind of cold running down their spine. He announced that he had killed the Lord of Ibrahim. The court received this. The ministers accepted this. The soldiers stood at attention for this. And this moment of collective agreement with a lie so enormous that the sky itself should have cracked with the absurdity of it, this is perhaps the most human detail in the entire story of Namrud. Because what it shows us is not merely the madness of one man, but the madness of the systems that form around powerful men, the systems of silence and performance and self-preservation that allow a single arrogant human being to stand in front of thousands of people and say something that everyone knows is false, and to have every single one of those thousands nod along, because the cost of disagreeing is higher than the cost of one's own soul, and the soul, in such systems, is always the first thing surrendered. Ibrahim heard of this claim. He had heard everything. He had watched the tower fall, and watched the vulture contraption rise, and watched the arrow descend with its borrowed blood. And through all of it, he had remained what he had always been, a servant, a friend of Allah, a man anchored to the truth so thoroughly that no spectacular performance by a false king could dislodge him even slightly. He came to Namrud one final time, not in anger, not in triumph. In the particular kind of sorrow that a truthful person feels when they look at someone who has been given every opportunity to come home and has refused every single one, he said, "Abandon this arrogance. Repent. Return. The God you have declared war on is the true Lord of all creation. It is not too late. The door of return is still open. Walk through it." Namrud's response was the response of a man who has forgotten what doors are for. He said, "Bring me an army, and I will bring you a bigger one." He said, "Assemble your forces, and we will see whose power stands." He was still thinking in the language of armies and resources and numbers and force, still fluent in the only language that 400 years of absolute power had taught him. The language of comparison. The language of whose is larger, and whose is greater, and whose reaches further. He had never learned the other language, the language of surrender, the language of the creature before the Creator. And because he had never learned it, he could not hear it, even when it was spoken directly into his face by the man Allah had chosen as his close friend. And so the final appointment was made. "Come to the field outside the city," Ibrahim said. "Bring everything you have." And Namrud, whose confidence in his own power had not wavered through any of it, not the fire, not the debate in the throne room, not the fallen tower, came to the field. He came with armies of a scale that the ancient world measured not in thousands, but in tides. Soldiers whose armor caught the morning sun and turned the plain into a moving mirror of reflected light. Horses and elephants, and siege engines and banners that filled the horizon in every direction. He sat upon a raised throne at the center of all of it, the king of the greatest army ever assembled in the ancient world. Looking out over his power and feeling, one imagines the specific satisfaction of a man who has spent his whole life building something enormous and is finally looking at the complete picture of it. He waited for the response. He expected something large, a rival army perhaps, or some manifestation of divine force that he could meet and measure and ultimately overpower with the sheer weight of what he had assembled. What came from the horizon was not what any of them had expected: a darkness. A moving, living darkness that devoured the distance between the horizon and the army with a speed that seemed to belong to a different order of things. A sound first, a low thrum that built as it approached, a vibration that entered through the soles of feet and worked its way upward through knees and hips and chest until it sat in the ribcage like a second heartbeat. Then the darkness resolved into what it was. Not cloud, not cavalry, not any weapon in the catalogue of human warfare. Mosquitoes, millions upon millions of them. A living storm. A tide of wings and legs and tiny mouths that came from the direction of the horizon like the shadow of judgment itself. They blotted out the sun. This detail, the blotting out of the sun, is recorded in the traditions and carries a weight beyond the merely physical. Because Namrud had, at various points in his career as a false god, made claims about the sky and what lay beyond it. He had fired arrows at it. He had built structures to pierce it. He had sent birds into it, carrying his arrogance. And now the sky itself, by the command of the one who owns it, sent darkness back down at him. Not the dramatic darkness of a storm or an eclipse, but the darkness of an uncountable swarm of the smallest, least impressive, most easily dismissed creatures in Allah's creation. The message written in that darkness was unmistakable. You thought you could reach the sky. Here is what the sky sends to meet you. Before a sword could clear its scabbard, before a single horse could be directed toward the approaching cloud, the swarm fell, and armor meant nothing. This detail is crucial. The engineers of Babylon had studied the problem of war for centuries. They understood how to harden a soldier against the weapons of other soldiers, the sword and the spear, and the arrow and the siege engine. But no engineer in the history of any civilization has ever designed armor against a million tiny mouths that can find the gap between any two pieces of metal, that can slide through the visor of any helmet, that can navigate the space between scale and plate, that can enter through the ear and the nostril and the corner of the eye. They pierced iron, flesh, and bone. The strongest men in Namrud's army, the ones with the broadest shoulders and the most decorated battle records and the most elaborate armor, fell first, because the armor that was meant to protect them created crevices and channels that the swarm exploited. Horses that had charged through lines of enemy soldiers without flinching collapsed in screaming confusion. Elephants that had been trained to ignore the chaos of battle stampeded through their own ranks, crushing men beneath feet that could not distinguish friend from attacker when the attacker was everywhere at once. In what the traditions describe as the span of a moment, the greatest army in the ancient world was reduced to silence and bones. The plain that had gleamed with armor now held only the aftermath of something that human military science had no framework to process. And in the center of all of it, untouched, preserved, not a single sting upon him, sat Namrud on his throne. This was not mercy. This was a different kind of judgment. The one who had declared himself God was being made to watch the complete destruction of everything. He had built his false divinity upon his armies, his power, his guarantee of earthly invincibility while being preserved intact for a purpose that he could not yet see and that was already traveling toward him. He fled to his palace, still alive, still physically whole, still the king of a city, whose army now existed only as a memory scattered across a field outside the walls. He sat down to catch his breath. And that is when she arrived. One mosquito, lame. The narrations are precise about this. She was lame, weak, with a broken wing, a creature so marginal and small that in ordinary circumstances a man of Namrud's stature would not have noticed her existence. Allah had held this one back from the swarm. Allah had appointed this one, this broken, barely flying, easily dismissed fragment of creation, for a specific purpose. While millions of her kind had destroyed an army, she had a single task. She settled on Namrud's nose. He brushed her away. She returned. He brushed her away again. She returned. Again and again, with the particular persistence of a creature that has a divine appointment to keep, she found her way back to his face. And then, on one of those returns, she went further. She entered his nostril. She climbed the passages of his skull. She reached his brain. And in his brain she began her work. Every movement she made registered in Namrud's skull, not as a tickle or a minor irritation, but as a blow, as a hammering, as a splitting agony that built upon itself with each moment she was inside him. He who had never felt a headache, who had ruled 400 years without a single day of illness, who had believed his physical invincibility to be part of the evidence of his godhood, he was now writhing on the floor of his own palace, screaming, tearing at his own face, howling for help in a voice that bore no resemblance to the measured, theatrical voice of the king who had once calmly ordered executions and rationed grain as instruments of his claimed divinity. "Strike my head," he ordered his servants. "Strike it now." And this instruction, this desperate, humiliating, completely undignified instruction from the man who had once made others bow at his feet, became the new rhythm of his days. Lines of servants were organized to beat their king's skull with sandals, not swords, not the weapons of warriors, the footwear of common people. The thing that the lowliest person uses to protect his feet from the ground was applied to the head of the man who had once made the ground itself tremble with his armies. The blow of a sandal against a skull was the only thing that temporarily stunned the mosquito into stillness, giving Namrud a moment of relief before the creature resumed her work and the agony returned. The scholars who preserve this account tell us that as he had ruled for 400 years, so he suffered for 400 years. This is a precision of divine justice that should be contemplated at length. Not 400 years plus 1 day, not 400 years minus a decade, 400 years calibrated to match the exact duration of his reign, because the justice of Allah is not approximate and not random. It is precise. It is proportional. It accounts for every year, every act, every grain of power extracted from those who came to the granary gates with empty bowls and were forced to choose between their souls and their survival. Every one of those transactions was recorded, and the accounting arrived in the brain of a king who could not swat a mosquito, administered by the most fragile instrument in Allah's creation, for exactly as long as he had imagined himself beyond accounting. At the end of 400 years, a blow cracked his skull. The lame mosquito emerged. And the life of Namrud, lord of Babylon, first man to crown himself king, claimant to divinity, firer of arrows at the sky, the builder of towers to challenge the heavens, his life ended on the floor of his palace, surrounded by servants, holding sandals, beneath the weight of a judgment as precise and as irresistible as the rising of the sun that he once claimed to control. The ruins of Babylon still scar the earth of Iraq. People visit them not as pilgrims to a holy place, but as visitors to a lesson, to look at the physical remains of what happens when a human being mistakes the loan of power for the ownership of it. The baked bricks of Babylonian walls, some of them still bearing the stamp of Namrud's name, have outlasted every claim their maker made. They are silent now. They have been silent for millennia. And that silence is itself a kind of speech, the speech of things that remain when the voice that commanded them is gone. Meanwhile, Ibrahim, the man who stood in Namrud's throne room without an army or a palace or a political office or a single material advantage, who was thrown into a fire and walked out unscorched, who was expelled from his homeland and walked into the unknown with nothing but the companionship of his Lord. Ibrahim is honored by billions of human beings every single day. His name is spoken in prayer. His memory is celebrated in pilgrimage. The Kaaba that he raised with his son Ismail in a barren valley, without trees or water, stands today at the center of the most visited place on earth, circled by millions who have crossed oceans and deserts and the full length of their own lives to stand before it and say, "Here I am, O Allah, here I am." The tower Namrud built to announce his defiance is a memory and a warning. The house Ibrahim built in submission is a living monument that has outlasted every empire the ancient world produced. This is the verdict of history. This is the measurement that does not change, regardless of how the political boundaries of any given century are drawn. What is built in arrogance falls. What is built in submission endures. The pride of Namrud sought to write its name across the sky, and found instead that it was written only in the record of a cautionary tale, passed from generation to generation, as evidence of what happens when a mortal forgets that he is mortal. Ibrahim sought nothing for himself. He asked only for the truth, and then lived by it without compromise and without apology. And the world that came after him, the world that still sends peace and blessings upon him in every prayer, that still tells his story to its children, that still faces the house he built in the direction of its worship, that world is his inheritance. Not because he demanded it, because he submitted. Because he understood something that Namrud, with all his 400 years of power, never once grasped. That the only true greatness available to a human being is the greatness of knowing one's own smallness before the one who is actually great. Honor and humiliation are not distributed by wealth or military strength or the number of people who call your name. They are not determined by the height of your throne or the size of your army or the reach of your influence. They belong to Allah. He gives them as He wills, to whom He wills, when He wills, according to a wisdom that operates on a scale that no human calculation can encompass. Namrud pursued honor by force and was left with a mosquito in his brain. Ibrahim pursued truth in submission and was elevated in the heavens and on the earth, and in the prayers of every Muslim who has ever lived, and every Muslim who will live, until the day that the sky itself is rolled up like a scroll, and the account of every soul is finally, completely, and perfectly settled. The fall of Namrud is not a story about ancient Babylon. It is a story about the permanent architecture of human reality, the structure of it that does not change when the century changes, or when new technologies arrive, or when new forms of power replace old ones. The structure that says there is a creator and there are created things, and the created things that remember this thrive, and the created things that forget it fall. And the fall is always proportional to the height of the forgetting. Clay returns to clay. Every crown placed on a human head by a human hand is made of the same material as the dust it will eventually return to. And the only authority that outlasts the dust is the authority that never needed a crown to begin with. The authority of the one who was before Babylon and will be after everything that comes after it. The one before whom Namrud's 400 years of empire and his 400 years of suffering were both, in the scale of eternity, a single brief and cautionary breath. This is the story of Namrud, and it is a warning, and it is a mercy, and it is a call to every soul that has tasted any power at all, however small, however large, to lay the crown down, to remember the clay, to walk in the light of submission to the one, before the mosquito comes,